Afternoon, everyone, or good morning, or good evening, depending on where you are joining us from. My name is Taryn Williams, and I am the past president of the Association for Preservation Technology, APT. And APT's mission is to promote the best technology for conserving historic structures and their settings, and to cultivate the exchange of knowledge throughout the international community. Welcome, everyone. We are so glad to have you all here with us. We're here today to talk with author Rosa Lowinger about her book, Dwell Time. And the intent of the conversation today is that it will be meaningful to people who have not read the book, as well as to those who have. And this is webinar format, so we will be leaving some time at the end from questions from the audience. I'm going to start the conversation by reading an excerpt of a recent review. Described in a starred review as a masterful revelation about life and art imitating each other in maintenance and repair, Dwell Time is an illuminating debut memoir by one of the few prominent Latinas in the field of art and architectural conservation, a moving portrait of a Cuban Jewish family's intergenerational trauma, and a story about repair and healing that will forever change how you see the objects and places we cherish and how we manage damage and loss. Renowned art conservator Rosa Lowinger spent a difficult childhood in Miami among people whose losses in the Cuban Revolution and earlier by the decimation of family in the Holocaust clouded all family life. After moving away to escape the, quote, cloying exiles nostalgia, Lowinger discovered the unique field of art conservation, which led to her work in sites around the world. Eventually returning to Havana for work, Lowinger suddenly finds herself embarking on a remarkable journey of family repair that begins, as it does in conservation, with an understanding of the origins of damage. The first memoir by a working art conservator is organized by chapters based on the materials Lowinger handles in her thriving private practice, such as marble, limestone, bronze, and ceramics. Lowinger offers insider accounts of conservation that form the backbone of her immigrant family's story of healing that beautifully juxtaposes repair of the material with the repair of the personal. Through Lowinger's relentless, clear-eyed efforts to be the best practitioner possible, while squarely facing her fraught personal and work relationships, she comes to terms with her identity as Cuban and Jewish, American and Latinx. Dwell Time is an immigrant's story seen through an entirely new lens, that which connects the material to the personal and helps us see what is possible when one opens one's heart to another person's wounds. So that was from a recent review. And now I'm going to introduce Rosa to you by reading her bio. Rosa Lowinger is a conservator of sculpture and architectural materials. A graduate of NYU's Institute of Fine Arts, she is the founder of RLA Conservation LLC, a practice with offices in Los Angeles and Miami. A fellow of the American Institute of Conservation, the Association for Preservation Technology, and the International Center for Conservation in Rome, Rosa was the 2009 Fellow in Conservation at the American Academy in Rome, where she conducted research on the history of vandalism to art and public space, and has led many architectural trips to Cuba, including one for APT in 2013. Rosa is also an author of articles on conservation and preservation for general audiences, and the books Tropicana Nights, The Life and Times of the Legendary Cuban Nightclub, and Dwell Time, the Memoir of Art, Exile, and Repair, that we'll be talking about today. And for more information on Rosa's writing and RLA Conservation's compendium of projects, you can find her at rosalowinger.com and rlaconservation.com. And it is my pleasure to introduce you all to Rosa Lowinger.
Thank
And
you.
Rosa, I'll ask you to start by reading an excerpt from your book, anywhere that you like.
Anywhere that I like. Oh my goodness. Well, okay. I'm first of all, thank you to everyone for taking time from everyone's very busy schedules to come here and for the support that APT has given to me with this project. Just before I read something, I just wanted to say that my initial goal and my primary goal in writing this book, what it morphed into was something else. But my first goal was to kind of write something that would unpack our field for a general audience. And when I say our field, I mean specifically what it means to conserve the materials of historic places, buildings, and sites. Because though I trained in art conservation, my work just kept getting bigger, and suddenly I work primarily on monuments and large-scale sculpture and buildings. And when people talk about conservation, they think, and even now to this day, I'll talk to people and they think I'm a paintings conservator. But the idea was to kind of demonstrate that what we do has a uniqueness, and what its value is. And I'm going to just start with the beginning, because the beginning unpacks the family component, because this thing is about two different types of topics. One is about my work and our work, and the other is about family. And in particular, the family portion is twined around my mother and her way of being and her relationship with me, etc. So I guess I could have put it up on my screen, because I do have copies of it that are virtual, but I think I'll just do it from the book. So I'm just going to read the first page and a half. And one of the things about the book, and if people who haven't read it, it's organized by materials. So I took the structure of it from the memoir of Primo Levi, the Italian chemist who writes about his family using chemistry as the unifying metaphor. So ours is based on materials. So the chapters are marble, concrete, bronze, wood, terrazzo, et cetera, et cetera. And I'll start. In a Jewish orphanage, this is marble, chapter 1. In a Jewish orphanage on the edge of Old Havana, a little girl drags a soapy rag over a long white marble tabletop. There are 20 of these tables, and twice a day, this 6-year-old's job is to scrub 10 of them clean of chicken, rice, and black beans, the typical ingredients of a Cuban supper. Pork would never be served here, of course. Neither would beef, because it costs too much. On Friday nights, the orphans might eat soup with matzo balls or long egg noodles slathered with chicken fat called schmaltz. The girl likes both of these foods, but she won't eat buckwheat groats, kasha varnishkas, no matter how hungry she is, how much they spank her or send her to bed hungry. She is maddeningly stubborn. Beatings don't subdue her. Neither does making her scrub the marble tables, the hardest task given to any of the little children. This girl became my mother. She was born on September 8, 1932, a national holiday in Cuba celebrating La Virgen de la Caridad del Cobre, the island's patron saint. Most Catholic girls born on this day would be named some version of Caridad, charity in Spanish. They would be dressed in yellow baby clothes, the color linked to Ochum, the powerful female Yoruba spirit deity that is syncretized with the Virgen de la Caridad. My mother's parents named her Ita in Yiddish and Hilda in Spanish. 3 weeks later, her mother died. I was a 10-pound baby, my mother says, blaming herself. She also faults a system that required C-sections be authorized by a priest or rabbi. By the time the rabbi arrived at the hospital, I had torn my mother up. In Afro-Cuban religions, each Orisha or spirit deity manifests specific qualities of the supreme being. Ochum controls fresh waters, rivers, divinity, fertility, and love. The men and women born under her guardianship are gregarious and friendly, seductive, the life of the party. But cross them and watch out. This river Orisha is vain, spiteful, and very quick to anger. I don't forgive and I don't forget, my mother has said, for as long as I can remember. So the other thing I want to just say here is that I start with my mother and her cleaning marble tables in this little orphanage. And then I cut to this part here that I write, I too am an expert cleaner of marble. I am a conservator, specializing in sculpture, decorative objects, and historic architectural materials. In art conservation, we avoid harsh processes. We are the masters of the slow and steady, using only methods and materials that do their job without inflicting undue damage. This takes many different forms, but in cleaning, The measure of how long it takes to clean a work of art is called its dwell time. Dwell time can also mean the total time a person spends in an airport or looking at a web page, or the time a family lingers at a border or an airport, or the time that you live in a city before moving on. But in conservation, dwell time references something chemical. The stronger and more reactive a material, the shorter it takes it time to do its job, and vice versa. We wash our hands, for example, for 20 seconds, because that's the amount of time that soap needs. That's the amount of dwell time soap needs to kill viruses. If you wash your hands with bleach, the dwell time would be shorter, but your skin would burn and peel, the remedy worse than any possible disease. The same is true for buildings and works of art. So, enough that.
Thank you, Rosa. And I'll say that I have my copy of the book right here that you gave me at our conference and you signed for me, and I read it all the way back on the plane from Seattle to Washington, D.C. And then I read it every night when I went to bed until I was done because I could not put it down. It was really compelling.
Thank you.
So the first question I want to ask you, Rosa, is where did you learn to write like this?
Oh gosh, thank you. In the 1980s, in the late 1980s, I was married to an academic, and he got a job in Charleston, South Carolina. And I, who had left Miami to move to the Northeast, because as I write in the book, for me, this Cuban immigrant, the Northeast had this kind of allure and this aura of being so quintessentially American. Philadelphia, Boston, New York, places like that. And suddenly I'm in Charleston, South Carolina. And even though it was that kind of place, it was a very small city and not where I wanted to go. And I was just kind of a bit at loose ends. And a friend of ours, a professor of playwriting, suggested that I sit in on his class. And I did, just as a way to have something to do. And I wrote a play. And I wrote a play with the voices of people that I knew, my family, because, immigrants who learn English have a particular way of using language. And so that is what happened. So it began through theater. But then, you write and you write. And it's like anything else. You exercise the muscle. It's like the way painters or sculptors say, painters in particular, that they say they get better with the more brush time they have, the more they are standing at their easel, the better their painting gets. So it's about doing it. But thank you.
You're welcome. And so now I'm wondering, where did the idea for this book come from? And how did it relate to your time in Rome as a Rome Prize Fellow? Can you tell us more about that?
Sure. Well, as I said when I first began, I'm sure this happens to a lot of us who are in preservation, conservation, and whatever we work on. Like, people don't always kind of know what we're doing or why we're doing it. And they don't understand the difference between why doesn't a regular contractor do this kind of work as opposed to a preservationist. So I wanted to write something that unpacked the work we do. And when I say we, I'm using a very broad brush for that. I'm talking about preservation architects, conservators, architects themselves, anyone that deals with sustainability of historic fabric and its preservation. And that was my goal, because really, we read a lot of articles about our work in the New York Times and the Atlantic. The New Yorker loves things related to our work, but no practitioner had actually ever written a book for a popular audience. And by the way, that's not entirely true. Some people have written books, but they were not written by writers who knew how to communicate with a general audience. And I'd already had one book under my belt. The idea is to tell a story in a way that you can sneak information in there for people to get understanding of what.
Yeah.
And I was in Rome when I was doing it, because, I had this Rome Prize on vandalism, and everybody wanted me to write a book on vandalism. And the truth is that my Rome Prize on vandalism was just like a kind of cool story that I had concocted at the time. And it turned out to be something in the end, but this was, in order for us to get traction in the world, for people to want to preserve buildings and make sense of what we do, it has to become a popular topic. It has to be something that they want to hear. So
Mhm.
I thought this was something I could contribute to the dialogue.
Yeah. And did you first think of writing this book when you were in Rome doing the fellowship, or was it at a different point in time?
I did. Well, what happened is when I was in Rome, I found Primo Levi's book, The Periodic Table, which, by the way, audience, if you haven't read it, read it. It's small, it's beautifully written, and it's an extremely compelling narrative about family and profession and how you choose to do something based on some inner desires that you have that come from somewhere, right? Whether you're an immigrant or have had a particular type of trauma or whatever it is. So I had the idea then, but I didn't have the meat of it. You know, you need the juice to get something like that going. Um, and the thing is that I realized books sometimes take a long time to germinate, because that was in 2009.
Mhm.
Um, and I thought I wanted to write this book about our profession, about my profession, about repairing materials, about why we do it like this, and what that engagement with the material world produces in a person who does this for a living. But I didn't have the family tale, because I think my parents were both alive then. My mother is still alive. And I think it would have been hard to do it with my father alive as well. I think I needed only one of them around so I could speak my truth, because you know how it is with families. Parents can like kind of uh tell you, no, that's not what happened. This happened. And when there's two of them against you, and I don't have siblings that are my age, I have one brother and he's much younger, you really need to kind of sort of sink into your own story.
Hmm. That's an interesting observation. We might come back to that point. I just noticed a comment in the chat. So the title of that book you referenced was called The Periodic Table.
The
By
periodic table.
And the author is Primo Levi. Is that right?
I'll
Okay,
put it here.
beautiful. So when did you start thinking about why you had chosen your particular career, and what was going on in your life at that time?
You know, I chose my particular career in the late 1970s. I was a college student in Boston at Brandeis University. I was an artist. I had gone from painting to sculpture to printmaking, kind of flailing around, and I found art history also. I was working and you know, trying to come up with the next step for myself. And I realized I just wasn't a good artist. I didn't have anything to say. When you're an artist, you can be really technically adept, but if you don't have something compelling to say, you're not going to be a good artist. And I wasn't. And so didn't know what I was going to do next. And I had a professor at college whose wife was a very famous conservator of works of art on paper. And he said, you should think about becoming a conservator.
Hmm.
And through a series of flukes that I write about in the book, because I did not, like right now, it's really hard to get into these programs, right? Back then it was also, but I had this kind of backdoor in because this professor wanted me there. And I didn't know at the time that he was being courted for a big job at the Institute of Fine Arts at NYU. Anyway, I got in NYU. I was like a deer caught in the headlights. I'd never lived in New York. And New York is, you know, you can live in a lot of places, DC, Boston, Philadelphia, but New York is its own thing. I think Chicago has that energy as well, where like if you've never lived in a place like that, it just
Mhm.
steamrollers you. And but I had great colleagues that took care of me and were, you know, helped me through it. And so I literally kind of fell backwards into my work. I decided to go into sculpture conservation because I didn't think I could cut it in paintings, because that's where like everybody wanted to be. Paintings was what was cool. It was what was most glamorous. And even to this day, people, when they say conservation, they think of paintings. So that's what happened. And I fell into it. And then I fell into something else, which was I fell into private practice because at a certain point after I finished all my internships and fellowships, I had a young son who had some health problems and I had to leave work all the time. So part of what happens in this book is that these accidents of history, leaving Eastern Europe to come to Cuba rather than the United States, having to leave Cuba, growing up in Miami, it speaks to the idea that sometimes accident leads you to something very interesting.
Mhm.
Because I would have never gone into private practice otherwise.
Yeah.
Okay.
When did that reflection start for you on why you had chosen conservation and the connection with repair in your family? When did that first occur to you?
It occurred to me, well, honestly, at the very moment when I went into the field, where I knew that I was doing it because I wasn't good enough to be an artist, at that very moment, I recognized that there was a certain interesting metaphorical component to that work. And that it was when I was working in my first job at the Metropolitan Museum as an intern on the American wing on that fantastic Augustus St. Gaudens and John Lafarge mantelpiece that sits in the American wing. And I read about this. I realized that to do this work, you have to become very skilled at understanding damage and why damage happens. And of course, so much of what we do, all the diagnostics and documentation and investigation that precedes intervention, is about understanding damage. And if we were to think about repair on a personal or societal level, we have to kind of do the same work. So it was early on that I thought about it, but I didn't really understand that it might make an interesting deep dive, right?
Yeah. I mean, in just reading that part of your book, it caused me to reflect on why I might have chosen engineering and what it was within me that, I wanted to constantly improve. And so
Well,
it's
and it's fun.
interesting.
Yeah, and it's funny in specifically to engineering,
Mhm.
because engineers are, I'm fascinated by engineers and I love engineering. I would never have been able to be an engineer because I don't have as much of a critical scientific methodological mind. But engineers are obsessed with failure, and engineers think about failure, and you need to engineers understand failure and don't shy from failure. They get that that's built in to everything, and that in order for something to succeed, you have to understand at what point it will fail. Well, I think that's just kind of an amazing concept. And the other day someone was telling me, this friend of mine here in LA who runs the program at the LA Library, that as part of the Pacific Standard Time next phase thing that they're doing a bunch of programs on failure. And I said, "Are you going to include an engineer?" And she said, "I hadn't thought about it." I said, "Listen, you're missing the boat. It starts with engineers." So
Mm.
anyway.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting thought exercise for anyone who's reading this book and hearing this conversation. Like, why was it that we became architects or engineers,
Right.
contractors or conservators? What was it within this? That what need were we trying to meet there? So one other question for you in this kind of overarching category before I go into some of my technical questions, but what was the process of developing this book like? And what have you learned along the way about communicating the technical details of our careers with general audiences?
Great. Oh, that's good. That's a great question. And remind me to come back to architecture for a second, because I've had some thoughts about that too. So when you write a work of nonfiction for a general audience, the way writing works when you're not working within the academic field is that typically you need to have an agent to sell your book, because mainstream publishers won't even answer your phone calls. So for a work of fiction, if you're writing a novel, you have to write the book and they're going to buy it off of the book. You write the whole book and then you send it to an agent and then they look at it. But with nonfiction and to some extent memoir that is of this nature, like like a technical memoir, right? If you're writing, you know, The Liars Club, that's a different story. Then that skews more toward fiction. But when you're writing this kind of book, you have to write a book proposal. And a book proposal consists of you're basically trying to tell someone why they want this book. It's about a 50-page long document that includes like an introduction and an explanation of what your book's about. And then a section on you and why you're the right person to write this. And then this kind of diabolical section, which is the comparable titles, where you have to show them how many other books are like it, but not exactly like it, you know? Which in this case was kind of difficult because there's really nothing like it. So I use comps like the book Lab Girl by Hope Yaren that is about a scientist, or the magnificent H is for Hawk by Helen MacDonald, where she deals with the death of her father by training a hawk. And if anybody's interested in these titles, I can put them in the chat later. So I wrote this long book proposal. Oh, and then you need chapter headings. You need the chapter headings with what each chapter's about. And then they want you to do at least a 20-page sample chapter because they want to make sure your writing's good. So I did all of that. I worked with a book coach, by the way. If you're thinking of doing anything like this, I strongly recommend that you hire a book coach because it'll really get you out of yourself and your own ideas about what you think is good. Because in my case, I kept thinking, oh, I need more technical stuff. And my book coach kept saying, no, 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 you want more family stuff. You know, you gotta slip that technical stuff in there that way. And then what happened is I sent it to all these agents. Every single one of them rejected it, except for one who said, I'm interested in this, and I only think that you should write me a larger sample chapter. Give me 50 pages of sample chapter. And I was like, oh God, really? Okay. But as I was working on it, the book coach that I had hired, talking about like the same way I fell into conservation, the book coach I hired got hired by a publisher that was a new publisher that had a big new following, and most importantly, there's a lot of small publishers out there, but it's all about distribution. And this publisher was distributed by Simon and Schuster. So they called me one day and they said, we've heard about this conservation family Cuban thing that you're putting together, and they bought it. And so they listened to this was January of 2022, and they said to me, we'd love to publish this book. We'd like to buy it, because they buy it, they give you an advance on your sales. But we need it in 10 months. Now, it's 360 pages. But I'm a big believer in the fact that, I'm sorry, when shit drops out of the sky, you just take it. And I did. And what I did is I said to them, look, let me call you tomorrow, because I went home, I sat down, I figured out what would it take to write another 60,000 words, because I already had 20, and manuscripts of this size are 80,000. It turns out it's longer than 80,000, but I had to give at least 80. I went home, I looked at my calendar, I mapped out what it would take to write this book in that much time, and it was doable. It was doable. To write 60,000 words in 10 months was 370 words a day, 5 days a week, with about 5 weeks to spare. And that's doable. 370 words a day is a page and a half. But what it doesn't leave you, the beauty of it is like, it doesn't leave you any time for mucking about and saying, oh, I've got writer's block, I can't do it. You just don't have time. When someone has given you a check and told you, you got 10 months to get this to me, you do it. And of course, they assigned an editor to me that worked with me to help me get it done.
Yeah. Wow.
That answers the question.
Amazing. So everyone is going to call you when we all start writing our books. And
please do. Please do. I'm all about, getting as much of our work out there as possible.
Yeah. Good. All right. So turning over to some of the more technical questions, I want to get into conservation and preservation. And so you have worked on both objects and buildings. And can you talk about the similarities and the differences in philosophy and practice between the two?
And I speak about that in a chapter on ceramics. where I talk about the difference between repairing things in such a way that there are, as you do with objects in sculpture, where you leave the possibility of replacement and not replacement, of retreatment. And we toss around these words like reversibility that we don't talk about so much anymore, but still. And I talk about the fact that, like, if you have a broken vase, ceramic vase or terracotta, you're not going to replace it. You're going to put it back together. And if it's got repairs in it, that's fine, you know, and you want to do it in such a way that you could redo it. But if you've got glazed terracotta cladding on a building, you might be able to do that, but you have to fundamentally, first and foremost, understand what that cladding is intended to do, which is protect the building, and that you can't allow for the failures to recur. If, you know, someone spends $5 million repairing the terracotta on the blah blah building, and there's scaffolding up for, you know, 2 years, if they have to replace it, they have to replace it. And even though we hate to think about that as conservators, because we have this kind of mystique of the original, you sometimes have to preference what is going to be most sustainable. Now, that said, who gets to make that decision? And what the problem is, that I think that in our profession, when those of us who are in this room are pondering the question, we're usually going to come up with an ethical answer. But very often, if you ask the developer or a contractor who doesn't know how to do it, they're just going to say, oh, it can't be done. You have to replace it. As this is a perfect, you know, one of the perfect examples are terrazzo repairs, which is something my firm is good at and I love to do. Most contractors will tell you that it can't be done, that it just has to be replaced. But you know, so that's the philosophical difference in a nutshell. You know, you can get really in the weeds about it, but and of course, if something's on the inside of a building, where as opposed to the outside is different than the inside, and that's true for sculpture as well. You know, we don't preserve the paint surface on an outdoor sculpture. We repaint them when it's messed up.
Yeah, thank you. So the next question I want to ask is something that comes up in your chapter on bronze on page 144 of your book, which is where you talk about a big mistake that you made in your work and the shame that you felt about it. And now you've told the world about it in this book, but I'm curious.
Right, that's a different chapter. That's the pigment chapter.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Right, but that's okay.
This was like the career, you know, the career mistake that really got you thinking about mistakes that we make as professionals and shame, et cetera. I'm just opening that up to find it myself, but I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that and what you learned about failures and how much or how little you had talked about it at the time. You know, this is where in your book it says mistakes are devastating to conservators, and they're devastating to all of us as professionals.
Right. You know, there are mistakes and there are mistakes. There's a mistake like this one, which was essentially that I failed to properly test the pigment surface on an indigenous object, and didn't realize that it was a mix of calcium carbonate and kaolin, a clay, which swelled when you put it in water, so that when I consolidated the surface to then soak the salts out, the kaolin swelled and just fell off, so that I put this thing in a bath to soak it. And I did a lot of testing, but I just didn't see that one thing. And that was in part because I was working alone and I had no one to bad ideas with, right? And it was terrible. You know, I started to see this artwork, this object that had survived years, that had belonged to an indigenous tribe from New Guinea, just kind of start to disintegrate before my eyes. And that was very humiliating. And of course, remember that part of what I write about too is about coming from a family where I was just blamed left and right for everything, where I had a very unstable parent who just raged uncontrollably at a moment's notice. And so it just really triggered that sense of worthlessness that you carry inside in those situations. And that was a terrible mistake. But I couldn't, but in fact, it was an understandable mistake because I thought I was making good decisions. I tested what I thought something was. I failed to see one thing, and the net effect was a bit devastating, but no one died. You know what I mean? And it also involves learning how to honestly come forth with your mistakes. When I've trained a lot of young conservators, and one of the things that just I find very important is to say to people, this work requires a great deal of doubt and honesty. And you have to doubt yourself and you have to be honest, because that's where the meat of it is. That's where the the brilliance of what we do is in the fact that we question ourselves, and we can honestly speak to our mistakes. You don't always have to broadcast them, and you don't always have to broadcast them to your clients. That's something I tell the staff. Look, with a client, if you can make it right and 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 not give them the most devastating version of what happened, that's okay too. I think it's different, like I know a Cuban woman whose father engineered the Champlain Towers. He was the engineer. He died many years ago, fortunately, but that's a different kind of mistake. That's a mistake that I don't know what you do about, But it also goes to the idea that as long as you begin with a degree of honesty about what you're doing, which is very hard for many of us to do. And I certainly write about how hard it was for me to be truthful about things, because we all come with our baggage about the way our families treat us or society treats us. And, if you come, for example, from a group that is treated less well than others, it's going to be harder to step up and say, yeah, I made a mistake. So I hope I didn't go on too long about that.
No, I think this is important for, some of the emerging professionals on this call to hear. And I'd argue that it's important for all of us on this call to hear, because we really value our clients and we value the buildings and objects we work on. And to read your account of making a mistake and to hear you talk about it, I think it's important for all of us as professionals. So thank you.
Yeah, and you know what? One more thing around that, because so when I talk to anyone that I'm mentoring, and I said, just be honest about why you can't do it. The answer can be because I didn't have enough time to get there, because they only gave us 2 weeks, and to do it right, it would have taken 5 weeks, or the budget just didn't allow for it, or which in buildings is much more acceptable than in sculpture, right? In artwork, we're trained in the art conservation programs like at Winterthur and NYU to kind of have a sort of quasi-religious approach to the work, that it's almost a sacrilege if you don't do it the right way. But sometimes you just can't. Your client is not going to pay for you to run 500 cross sections to make sure you know exactly what color it's going to be.
Right, right. Yeah, thank you for that.
Sure.
So in the silver chapter, I believe this is page 167, you describe conservation work on heavy iron leg shackles, and that you were, quote, not yet attuned to the fact that heritage preservation requires the input and participation of communities that produced or were impacted by artifacts. Can you talk more about what this work was and what you learned from this experience?
So this was when I was living in Charleston, and I got there I was in Charleston, and I felt like a total fish out of water, and there was nowhere to work that was, that made any sense to me. And I became a private practitioner, and I got hired to do some work on some objects at the Charleston Museum. And among the objects were a series of iron pieces that had been used in the control and enslavement of Black African, of human beings. And this is 1986. Back in 1986, our profession had not yet evolved into the understanding that treating objects of that nature, require, or sites or whatever it is. I mean, no one would think in their wildest dreams right now to treat the barracks where people were enslaved without input from people whose families were impacted by that, and not even specifically, but culturally. Back then, there wasn't really that much consciousness, we all treated whatever we treated. I remember at the Penn Museum, when I worked on indigenous objects, I worked on whatever they felt like giving me. Nonetheless, those things, those pieces of metal, had a power that I felt even then. I feel it even now as I'm talking about it. And I don't mean to be woo-woo about it, but the reality of it is the materials contain energies about what they're used for and where they come from and what happens to them. And I remember thinking to myself, what do you do about an object like this that was used with such ill intent? And its preservation, why? Do we preserve it? Do we not? In a way, it harkens to some of the questions we have now about monuments of a certain nature, right?
Yeah.
That was a moment when I really suddenly had a feeling about something.
Yeah, thank you for that.
And yeah, and I think the work that's being done to actively open our field to people who have traditionally not been part of it is fundamental. I mean, it's the essence of what we need to do right now.
Yeah. So before we open it up for our audience questions, there's one more thing I want to ask about, and I'm going to shift gears to ask you about Cuba. And I'd love to hear more about what's going on with preservation in Cuba right now, and to hear about your recent trips with APT and, as recent as 2020.
So I haven't been to Cuba since 2020. I went, and this was a little APT. It wasn't APT sponsored, but it was a trip that was cooked up at the APT conference. It began to be cooked up at APT Buffalo by Joe Opperman and a couple of people. And then it kind of spun around for a while, and boom, January of 2020, we went. And we were there like people were already getting COVID, but we didn't know what it was. And Cuba has, my poor country, Cuba is an extraordinary place if people haven't been there. And it's extraordinary for us, for our community, because it is it was the center of the Western Hemisphere for so many centuries. And then when the Cuban Revolution happened, expropriating all property, development stopped, so things weren't torn down, but they've also not been maintained. And during the Trump administration, things got very bad. There was a lot of hope. During the Obama administration, things were about to open up. And then during the Trump administration, things shut down. And then COVID really kind of was devastating, because so much of Cuba depends on tourism, and they were hit hard. So I don't know what life is like there now in terms of preservation. There is a small group called Friends of Havana that is run out of the UK, so it can go around the embargo laws, that is running a symposium by invitation symposium with some experts from Latin America and the United States starting next Monday. So I'll be able to answer this question a lot more in about 2 weeks. But before you get to the questions, I wanted to say just one thing for our community. One of the things that I found while writing this, and specifically while talking about the book with audiences, is that in the day that in this age that we live in now, where it is so easy for information to be manipulated, for lies to become truths, for things that are not correct being spun into some other realities. What we do is so important, because materials and buildings do not lie. So, for example, I like to use Cuba as an example. The Cuban government has long held ideas about how there was no middle class in Cuba, that there were only extremely wealthy people and extremely poor people, which is absolutely not true. But more importantly, it is that falsehood is totally exposed by the fact that you have thousands of apartment buildings in Havana. And, you know, at the risk of possibly alienating anyone on this call, the Middle Eastern war that is being dealt with right now, where both parties are kind of accusing the other of having no claim to that land. The fact is that there's thousands of years of archaeological evidence that show that both you know, Palestinians and Jews have had presence in that land. So what we do matters because it gives a weight to truth that is immutable.
Beautiful. Thank you for that.
Thanks.
All right, so I'm going to open it up to a couple of questions. And if you have a question, raise your hand and I'll ask Sandra to help me if I am not seeing a raised hand. And I will just call on you. And if you're busy thinking of them, I can certainly ask Rosa more questions because I have a long, long list. But we'd love to hear from any of you who have a question for Rosa.
I'm so happy to see so many people here, you know.
Mhm. Okay, I'm not seeing any at the moment, so that's fine. Oh, Susan Pranger. Susan, go ahead.
And Eileen, of course.
Yes.
Somebody has to ask a question. First of all, this has been really fascinating. I just finished writing a book myself.
Ooh.
And so hearing all of that stuff about I had to do a proposal. I didn't get any money up front, but I did get somebody to publish it. And so I've been told that I should follow up with you to get some tips about how to market it. But
I'd be glad to. What's the book? What's the book?
It's called Old Materials, New Climate.
Ooh.
And you can Google that, Old Materials, New Climate. But
Did it come out already?
Yes, it just came out in February.
Congratulations.
I did mean to make this about my book, but
No, but still.
I wanted to say that it's so wonderful to hear about the things that you're going through, and you know, that whole psychological thing about having to put yourself out there and be willing to make mistakes and trying to make things readable really related to me. I guess that's not really a question, but I just wanted to say how much I really enjoyed this, and I've ordered your book. I haven't gotten it yet, so I'm really looking forward to reading it because it's, you know, I took a different tact, which was not my personal experiences, but talking about materials and then talking about case studies. And really, one of the most fascinating things in doing the research and looking at case studies was meeting the people that I met who were working on their projects and how passionate they feel about their preservation work or conservation work. It's really
That's great. That's
so
great.
maybe to come up with a question, did you, in your writing your chapters, your technical part of it, did you find yourself doing a lot of research, or were you able to draw on your past experience?
You have to do research because even if you draw on your own experience, you got to make sure that you're not just drawing on what you think is the right thing, and you've got to make sure you're getting the information right. And even with that, you hope that you have a good editor that's going to do good fact checking, and there it helps also to show it to colleagues. Like I had several colleague readers. I'm sure you all can imagine that Kyle Normanton was one of them for me. Yeah, to make sure that, you know, you weren't like saying something that was just profoundly not true.
Mhm.
Beautiful. Thank you, Susan.
Thank
Eileen
you.
Taylor.
Okay. I disconnected at the conference, so I didn't get my copy from you directly, so you still need to sign it. But I
Okay.
ordered it right away, and oh, I'm not done talking. Okay, that was you. It's confusing. Anyway, I love the book, and sort of what I was wondering about was how you decided on the order of the materials that form the chapters so that there was a logical flow to the personal stories along with the information, which from an outsider might have seemed like you could have put them in any order, but it seemed important that you chose chapters that went along with your story. So there had to be an outline in your mind of how you flowed the topics for the chapter titles.
That's a great question. So I had, by the way, in the book proposal, there was one order, and then as you write, there was a different order. And that is how did I made a decision based on the family story and where I was and what materials made sense. But then what happens is the muse rewards you. When you sit and write every day, when you show up every day and you sit there and you do it, the muse rewards you. It really freaking does. And then you will find that it has a flow. It becomes this sort of like, caramelized kind of energy that really just kind of functions. And then your editor helps, because I remember my bronze chapter wasn't where it was somewhere else. And the editor said, you got to cut this other thing and move bronze here. And that's the way I did it.
That helps, because I've often imagined trying to write a book like this for architecture, but I never went that far. I mean, working on the historic preservation book was a big effort that in the middle teens I had to do, and the amount of change in the publishing industry was huge from when our book was first published in our first edition in 1999 to where it came out in 2018. Huge difference, and we were much more on our own, but we get a royalty check, and that's kind of nice. Yay. Okay, thank you, Rosa, and I hope to hear you in other venues as well. It's great to have you representing APT for this.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Eileen. Caroline Alderson. Caroline, you are still muted.
There we go. Thank you. Now it's working. And I am so grateful that I was one of the lucky people that's noticed this crowd hovering around a table in Miami and ran up and got my copy signed by the author and adore the book. It's an astounding achievement and a rich read and a rich reread. And because the audiobook is also wonderful and I love hearing you read. So I recommend that, and I recommend it as a gift. It's a great gift for people who share an interest in the materials or that story. I'm actually giving an audiobook as a gift to a Russian immigrant friend that has had some interesting parallels in life pattern. And I love the material metaphor. You couldn't have done better than to start with marble. And with the orphan. So that's going to lead me to my completely non-technical question, because we have to know, since she's still alive, how did your mother respond?
Thanks for the question. So, for those of you who haven't read the book, my mother is all over this book, and a lot of it is how difficult she was to live with. But part of what I do with the book is that I kind of explain it away. I explain the understanding of damage. That's what it is. That said, there are a couple of chapters that paint her in a very harsh light because they were my reality. And I knew they were going to be hard for her to read. So what I did at first is I made clear to her what I was doing, and she shared a lot of her stories with me all along while I was writing. There was some great, that crazy story about how she found all this money hidden in a suitcase because my father was having an affair. She shared that stuff with me, and she knew that was going to be in the book. And I told her, look, there are going to be some chapters in here that are hard. You were a difficult mother. That there were times when we had real problems, and I laid the ground. And then what I did is I gave her the book to read in final form before it was published. And I gave it to her out of order because I felt the story would be harder to hear. And I gave her the hardest things penultimately, and then gave her some good stuff. So I kind of mixed it up for her. And that said, when she actually read the full manuscript, when she read this start to finish, she had a hard couple of days, but she got over it. You know, I said to her, look, you are not a villain. No one thinks of you who reads this as a villain. People think of you as someone who suffered and did the best you could with what you had. But it's taken, you know, it's taken work. But in a way, sometimes when you let people know what they've done and how you feel about it, but love them anyway, it, you know, it stitches things back together.
Wow. Well, that was a very astute way to share it with her incrementally. And what I like is that, I mean, the common thread for a lot of other people is, I do this because I love you. And they always do. But often they're carrying with them so much of their own troubled past. That is why they want someone to love. So thank you. Just thank you so much for reaching so deep to share that with us.
Thanks, Caroline.
Thank you, Caroline. All right, I'm not seeing any more questions, and so I'd like to wrap up this hour with one final question for you, Rosa, which is, in the acknowledgement section of your book, you say that humility is the root of our work. Can you tell us more what you mean by this?
Yes, well, as I said before, humility is the root of our work because we must be scrupulously honest with ourselves about what's possible and what isn't.
Mhm.
And we need to really, when you confront the material world, it too can be interpreted. So you have to make sure that you're not interpreting in a way that allows you to do whatever you want. You have to approach with humility. If you're gonna take the step of removing all of the cladding on a terracotta building, you better have humility about why you're doing that, and not just because you want to see it looking spanking brand new and shiny, you know? If you're gonna clean a building, you're gonna laser clean a building, you really need to understand that the laser cleaning is what has to happen, because the laser cleaning is going to cost a fortune, and you better be sure that that's really what you should do. So that's why I say humility is the root of our work.
Mhm.
You know, that's why I say that. And, you know, listen, we don't always approach with humility. We sometimes make the mistake. We just are like, oh, I want this client out of my life. So whatever gets them out of there faster is what I'm going to do. Or dang, this is a giant deep pocket and we could test, you know, until the cows come home. We've all had that situation, right? And we've all dealt with the professional, contractor, architect, designer, owner, developer that is just driving you crazy, and you don't want to do what they say because you just want to not do what they say. That's why humility is the root of your work. Just check, like, you check it at the door just to make sure, you know, check your ego here and there, make sure you're doing things for the right reason. And, you know, on that note of ego, if I may, if you like the book, please leave me a review on Amazon or Goodreads. Some person, some hater who won't even leave their name, gave me a 2-star review on Amazon. I don't know why. I don't even know who they are. And it's in there and I can't, and you know, I really just it just messes up the algorithm. So like it. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, Rosa, I can't believe how quickly an hour has gone. I have 3 times as many questions as I asked you, and I'm sure that lots of others do too. But it was really a treat to have you with us for an hour to talk about your book, to hear directly from you reading it, and to hear a lot more about these very honest stories you put in the book and why. And we are all so incredibly proud and so incredibly grateful. So thank you for spending this hour with us. Thank you for writing this beautiful book. And we will be talking with you. This interview will go on our website. It will be free and open to the public.
Great.
And we look forward to further supporting you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for being this community of people that I feel so close to. You know, really is wonderful to have this.
Thank you to everyone who attended. It was great to have all of you here. All right. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks,
Bye.
everybody. Have a great day. Bye. See you soon.